48.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Right, so I think we'll just head.
So sorry, I'm starting in a slightly strange point, but I want to start here because this is the earliest picture in the show, the Cornelis von Polenberg, and this is from what we were discussing earlier, the first generation of artists going to Italy. And this is probably painted around 1627, more or less, when he was in Italy. And one of the interesting things about this is that the support of the picture tells us a lot about the picture itself. Most of the pictures in this show have been cleaned, restored recently, and we've done a lot of technical analysis on them. We're in the process of doing a lot of research on our pictures at Dulwich because we are in the process of writing a scholarly catalogue of the collection. And our first volume of British pictures just came out, and we're now working on the Dutch and Flemish pictures. And it's about, each volume is about 250 pictures, so as you can imagine, it's a huge amount of work. As you'll go through the exhibition, you'll realize that quite a lot, most of the pictures are painted on canvas, which of course is the traditional support that you would use for painting, but a lot of them are also on panel, which is very common as well at this point. And also Dutch Italianates and other artists painted on copper as well. We don't have any coppers in this exhibition, but that would have been another support they would have used. Now when it comes to panels, to wood, there's usually a difference between the sort of wood that would have been used in the north and in Holland, or anywhere else in the north of Europe, and the support that would have been used in Italy. And so that, in a way, tells us a lot about where these pictures were painted. And this is a picture which was painted on poplar, which is the typical Italian wood used for panels. So if it wasn't for the dating, we would know that this was painted in Italy simply because of the wood it's painted on. And it's very likely that Polenberg bought this panel in Rome, in Italy, and painted on it. Most of the other panels you'll see in the show instead are painted on oak. And I think those are the two types of wood that are used for paintings usually. Poplar in Italy, oak in the north. And they're very good types of wood for this sort of thing. Later on, in the 19th century, mahogany comes in as a different type of wood, but of course mahogany didn't exist. I mean, didn't make it from the New World to Europe at this point. So anything that's painted on mahogany, it's after a certain date, for example. Just to show you this as a kind of example of the first generation of Dutch Italianates, it's this kind of typical Italian valley. I mean, you wouldn't have a landscape like this in Holland anywhere. And then you have in the middle ruins. And so there's this idea of kind of the antiquities and the sort of things you would see out in the Roman countryside at this point, depicted by Polenberg with a sort of little stream, or it's kind of unclear if it's part of a little lake, pond, or if it is a sort of river or stream. And then you get sort of peasants and shepherds, goats and cows, and sort of lovely running dog. But then you get these very strange figures here in costume. There's a man and a woman and a shepherd boy probably, pointing out in the distance, and we have no idea what they represent, but it's probably meant to be a recognizable scene, probably a historical scene of some kind. One of the problems with Polenberg is that he painted mythological scenes very, very often, but because he tried to set them in everyday life and everyday costume and that sort of thing, they then become impossible to identify as specific episodes. He sort of strips them of all the attributes and sort of things that point towards a specific story. So, I mean, it's unclear if that's a king and a queen and the shepherd is pointing to something, but it looks as if this should have originally been a recognizable scene depicted as such in this very sort of broad landscape. As we'll go and see the other paintings in the exhibition, you'll then realize that that's not always the case and things are actually much more on a day-to-day life. So let's move by Birken, because this is a Birken picture that looks nothing like a typical Birken picture. And so, in a way, let's start backwards. And we know it's by Birken because it's signed. But when it was acquired for the collection, people thought it was by different artists, by different Dutch artists. It wasn't thought to be a Dutch Italianate because the signature was not recognizable immediately. This is what a typical Dutch landscape, in a way, looks like. I mean, this is a typical Dutch forest, lovely Dutch cloudy sky, and sort of huntsmen and people at the bottom side of the forest. The one thing I want to point out about this picture, which is particularly fun and rather beautifully painted, is over here in the corner. There's a man on a white horse with a gun, and he's just shooting some animal outside the frame. And what you see here is the bullet shooting. You see a little bit of sort of fire, and the bullet kind of cutting through towards the frame. It's a sort of lovely detail. And obviously those two people are sort of huntsmen, sort of chasing some sort of animal. So having looked at this briefly, we then move to the ones on my right, which instead are from sheep and goats and peasants sort of all around. And then there's a man shoeing a donkey, just over here. This is set in a broad landscape again, and what here looks like a cliff is in fact a Roman ruin. I mean, this is the ruin of a temple over here. So this is a sort of kind of thing that you would have encountered in the Roman countryside on a day-to-day life. You go out, and there would have been peasants and sheep grazing amidst the ruins. And again, one of the wonderful things about this picture is the light. And as we'll go around, you'll realize that the light is one of the most important things for these artists. And the same is true here, where you have a classical fountain with bits of stone for monument, but it's used, obviously the cow there has just been drinking at that fountain, and the woman in the back is washing her clothes in the fountain. And presumably this woman is sort of directing that while another woman is milking a goat. So there is this kind of idea of a sort of ideal countryside and what you see in the countryside, in this beautiful Roman countryside. And of course, again, the hills and the mountains and all of that are things that you wouldn't have in Holland at all. I mean, Holland is mostly land that's reclaimed from the sea. It's flat. All you have is sort of sand dunes in a way, and forests.
Does this one have glass over it? Glass?
Yeah. Quite a lot of them have glass.
Now, are the ones that are wood panels covered in glass?
Mostly, yeah. Mostly is because of that.
So they won't warp, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's not just the warping, is that panels are more delicate than canvases. I mean, I know it should be the other way around, but it is. Panels are more, adjust more with different temperatures. I mean, canvases are more resilient. Panels are much more delicate and with different climate change, and you can imagine that going from London to Fresno is a bit of a challenge. So obviously they're glazed because of that.
Okay.
It's just a sort of conservation choice. In fact, the ones that are glazed are the ones that you can get closer to because they're glazed. The ones with the barriers are the ones
would
that...
let us.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're supposed to stay far.
18 inches away.
There you go, good. So, Birkham, let's... one thing before we move on from Birkham, just again, out of the idea of collecting and what Bourgeois and Desenfants were doing, they loved the idea of pendants. And they always loved the idea of like two pictures being together and having couples of pictures. And this went as far as the process of making pendants for pictures that didn't have pendants. And we have a lot of examples of this in the gallery where pictures are changed in size just to make them into pendants of something else. Now this is a picture which comes from a French collection, and a lot of the, I mean, where did Bourgeois and Desenfants buy the pictures? That's a whole other fascinating instance. And when you think that they were buying pictures in the 1790s, immediately you should think French Revolution. Everyone in France was selling everything. So of course, most of the pictures we have come from France. And a very large chunk of them comes from Calonne, who was the Minister of Finance of the beheaded King of France, who lent a huge amount of pictures to Desenfants as a loan for money. And of course, was never able to repay the loan, and so Desenfants kept the pictures. So we have a lot of Calonne and a lot of French pictures. This is another one that comes from an aristocratic family in France. And it was described then as a set of two, which were described in detail with the figures, and then they were called le midi and le soir, so midday and evening. So this is midday, and of course you see that the sort of light and the sun, kind of, midday scene. The picture you see over there in the similar frame was always considered to be le soir, the evening, and they were always displayed as pendants. What has been discovered recently is that when they were in this collection in France, they were engraved. Engravings were made after the two of them, and this is the midi, the other one is totally different. And so suddenly it was like, okay, what's going on here? And we worked out that Desenfants and Bourgeois only bought one of the two. Le Soir ended up somewhere else, but because they liked the idea of pendants, they bought a Birkham, which looks similar, and it's about the same size, put it into a matching frame, and then made them into midi and soir, even though when you look at the outline, you realize that it's not evening at all. And so that's, obviously, we should have worked that out a long time before. But
What was the name of the finance minister?
Calon.
Calon.
Calon. He's,
Two N's.
yeah, sort of